Greetings and welcome to the Open-Minded Skeptic podcast. My name is Sharon Ann Rowland and I'm your host. Our guests today are the hardworking father and son Progressive Archaeo Historian team of Stephen and Evan Strong. They are also current columnists inside our magazine, The Oddities E-Club magazine, which you can download our app and the first 8 issues for free today. Stephen is a secondary school teacher with a background in archaeology and education. He was involved in the formation of a graduate diploma of Aboriginal education for the New South Wales Department of Education. He wrote units on traditional law and contemporary history. His son Evan has a background in Anthropology and Indigenous Cultural Studies. He's also done Counselling and Mediation with a bachelor's degree in social sciences and graduate studies in psychology. Both Stephen and Evan have spent many years learning, living and working with the Bundjalung Language Confederation. That's in the Northern Rivers region of New South Wales. Also the Ramindjeri in South Australia and the Gumilaroi peoples, that's in northern New South Wales. Both operate under the doctrine of Wirritjin, which is short for black fella, white fella dreaming, and do everything in remembrance of Karno W, who is the spokesperson for the Ramindjeri. They work with a diverse, informal network of independent researchers, original custodians or elders, patrons, supporters, and of course, good friends. Stephen and Evan are currently based near Byron Bay in northern New South Wales. If you would like to find out more information about the boys, then please go to www.forgottenorigin.com. That's www.forgottenorigin.com. We will be doing free shows encompassing the highlights from 2 interviews done in 2018 and 2019 with Stephen and Evan. This is highlights number 1. Challenging the Out of Africa theory. What was the impetus or the reason that you decided to take on the Out of Africa theory and prove that the Aboriginal, that is the original people, are the true ancestors of Homosapien man?
Well, it's sort of a backdoor story because to begin with, we weren't involved in writing books. I never had any intention to write any books. I was a teacher. I've been a head teacher and a principal, and that's what I was doing, and I was teaching Aboriginal studies. And because I got heavily involved in the Aboriginal studies, and particularly in a place called Moree, which has got a high Aboriginal population, I started to teach the course, got very strong relationships with the kids I was teaching, and that opened up pathways and avenues to the adults. And then what I found in Moree over the years is they started to tell me more and more. And then I realised that the Aboriginal Studies course we wrote was primarily incorrect. So what then happened was when they went to do a review of the course, it had been hijacked by history teachers and turned into something it was never meant to be. I went back there and wanted to go after the first day, but I also told them that what we're teaching there is wrong and it's got to change because this is not what the original people believe of themselves. And got into a fairly heated discussion with the person who runs it for the state and demanded I leave after one day because I said I wasn't staying for the extra 3 days, came home early, and then realised if I was going to tell the truth, it wasn't going to be through the schools. We had to go and do it ourselves. So primarily what came out of that is because I decided I couldn't do it through the Department of Education, I made a very poor financial decision because I was at the top of the pay list there where it starts to become reasonable. Resigned and thought, okay, we'll write books and see how that works out. Now, it works out well for getting the truth out. Doesn't quite pull in the same money as I got before, but that was never the point.
I bet it doesn't. So,
No, it doesn't. But that's the point, because we knew that we were never going to get this through traditional mainstream means. And if we're going to talk about the truth, we had to do this properly. And I do remember at one stage what I was doing was basically going to school each day, and every spare moment at 3 o'clock, I'd be writing books. And I thought, well, I can't do both. So that's how I ended up where I am now.
Yeah, and we're really glad you are exactly where you are. Me personally, and so many others. So, and I've actually I spent today talking to a few people who just attended your last lecture in Brisbane, and they were all very impressed with it all. So, and completely mind blown, of course. That must give you a lot of good feelings when you completely turn a person's idea around, especially about the Aboriginal people as well, but also about the history and how it's been taken out of context.
Yeah, it does. It's basically what we were asked to do when I was given ceremony. That was a skill that I had with my son, and that's what we were asked to do when I was given my first ceremony, to break it in and teach people what we've been taught about all Indigenous cultures. Let's not just keep it in Australia here, but all Indigenous cultures. We've got to understand when the invaders came to these countries and fought with and defeated the original owners of both America, Australia, and many other places, the first thing they had to do is to justify something that wasn't justified. And that's when their history changed. What we're trying to do is to put it back to the way it was before the lies began.
Hiding the truth of our origin.
So for what reason or reasons would various governments, institutions and people within archaeological circles and historians want to hide the truth of our origins on Earth, do you think? What do you get out of that?
Well, I can tell you directly, because I've just written my third reply to letters from the Australian government threatening to put me in jail for 3 years. It's the third one I've got. One was about the Standing Stone site, and 2 have been about the skulls. Now, it's gone to the highest levels within the country. Now, it's a very good question. Why would they want to cover that up? Well, the problem is that the Standing Stone sites and the skull that we have at the moment, and the one that was being discovered 2 weeks ago and we know about, and the one we've dug up and had a look at, all 3 of them share features that are not a hominin and not a Homo sapien and look nothing like any being on this planet. We just had one of those skulls remade up into a complete cast of 3 dimensions, and the gentleman who did it is probably the best in this country, said there's nothing like it in the world. Why would the government want to cover that up? Because within that narrative, what we're seeing there is an off-world contribution, not only to the fact they were on this country and buried alongside us, but to our genetics and possibly even to our purpose and why we should be here. And as we found out in the Standing Stone site, our main goal was to be spiritual beings. Now, the government and the people in control and those that control the way we live from day to day and from year to year and century to century would prefer that we were basically in conflict with each other, always arguing, always fighting, not really realising we really have got an amazing potential. I mean, to explain what I mean by that, I took Graham Hancock when he spent some time in Australia to see our elder. And on that day, our elder actually disappeared in front of 10 people. And all those people will still tell you to this day, including Graham, that's exactly what happened. And we spoke about it later. And Karno spoke about it too, because he's the one who did this. And what he told us is that telepathy, disappearing, all these things are innate abilities that all humans have. I don't believe the government and I don't believe the people in control want humans to embrace what is really our purpose and the talents we actually have. So they create fear, they create conflict, and they create a history, this is the point I'm getting at, that makes it seem like we naturally are aggressive, spiteful creatures that fight each other, that warfare is part of our nature. What they're trying to cover up here is to stop people thinking about the fact that if we find out, as we will, that the mitochondrial DNA and genome of this being that has no forehead whatsoever, from the eyes up, it just slopes backward and slopes behind the eyes. In fact, 95% of the brain of this being is below eye level. Think about you and I and where most of our brain is found. This is a completely different thing. Now, what it tells me, and this is why I've had 2 letters on this one and one on the Standing Stone site, is the government's already tested these skulls. They know what's there, and they don't want people to know. Because if they know about it, they'll start to think about what our role is. And at the moment, personally, I think our role is basically global vandals when we're supposed to be galactic citizens. And if we find out that this being, which is so old, has been here for a long, long time, if it has been here this long and it is off-world and it has lived here with us, where's the potential for them to do it again? And more to the point, why did they come here? All of those questions are opened up, and it basically means that we've got to rethink who we are and where we are. They don't want that. They've told us who we are and what we are, and they want us to stay in line and do that. So I think it challenges the fabric of what it is that makes us what we think we are today, as opposed to what we ought to be tomorrow.
Exactly. And that kind of leads into disclosure. And I don't know if you realise, but I've had contact experience with a couple of entities. And I find a lot of people talk to me about why haven't they made contact to everybody? But I've always seen disclosure as a one-on-one basis, and it's kind of like you're all kind of given a job, and like mine was to start the magazine and to promote people like you. That's what I was actually told.
And I agree with you. And I think when people say they want that, what they're really saying indirectly is, we want Jesus to come down with a cross with his arms out. They want something in front of them. And it's never going to be that easy.
No.
I don't think it ever should be. I think it's a matter of faith. I mean, I absolutely believe what the elders told me about the coming and the awakening, and the fact that there will be Pleiadians, others who'll come here. But the point that was told me many times by the elders is when they come here, people then can't say, oh, yeah, I get it now, I'll become part of that team. It's too late. Your decision has to be made before there's an appearance, but people want the appearance first. The fact that you saw something personally, which is true, and set you on a path, that's what they wanted. What they don't want to do is to come out into the main shopping mall and wave to everyone and say, here we are, think about it, because that is not a matter of faith anymore. It's a matter of common sense. Oh, my God, all this rubbish about aliens and all this other stuff that the hippies were talking about, it's right. Well, we'll sign up now. It doesn't work like that. You have to sign up before anything is shown. That's part of the deal.
Completely agree.
Media repercussions due to Gangamaya.
The Gangamaya, did I pronounce that correctly?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's right.
Has challenged a lot of archaeologists, not to mention the Mungo Man site. And of course, we'll be talking about your own finding a little bit down the track here. Have you seen any repercussions in print or via the media, not your own repercussions, but just in general, since both of those have been exposed? Have any books, what I was really trying to get at there is, have they rewritten anything, or are they just kind of playing dumb?
No, what tends to happen is there's been a lot of very inconvenient pieces of archaeology that come out in Australia. Like, I'll give an example with Mungo Man. Mungo Man is dated by 45,000 years by Jim Bowler through analysing geology that's 200 to 300 metres away. It was dated 65,000 years by Alan Thorne by analysing 2 different methods on the burial site. Now, the interesting part with Mungo Man is 65,000 years is sort of killing the out of Africa theory, but more importantly, it has genetics that no being has today, but it's a Homo sapien. And that's a bit of an issue because they can't find where it comes from. So what they originally said was it's a mutated form of Homo sapien and of no importance. Therefore, let's not worry about it. The date's still an issue, but now what they did was recently they re-examined Mungo Man and did the genetics again. And they said, oh, sorry, boys and girls, we all told you it was a mutation. It's not a mutation. We've now found that it's got European genes in it. Now, I want you to think about that for a sec. European genes and Europeans come into existence 40,000 years ago. This being is found in Australia, which is 45 to 65,000 years ago, and has European genes. So what they then said was, oh, it's a sample that's been tainted. Therefore, we'll ignore it again. And I'm thinking, tainted by who? Europeans that don't exist? What it tells me is, if they wanted to follow it through, that it's got European genes because the Europeans come out of Mungo Man.
Exactly.
This is their great-grandfather. But no, they didn't see it that way. They said, oh, it's tainted in some way. And from that point, nobody goes back to it. It happens every time. There was a finding by Jim Bowler, the one that said it was 45,000 years, where he found a midden in Point Ritchie in Victoria, way down the bottom, 80 to 90,000 years old with human activity.
Wow.
What he said was, 80 to 90,000 years, what he said was, well, the techniques we used were great. The date is 80 to 90,000 years, I don't doubt that, but I'm not going to talk about it until we get another date like that, because I don't want to go any further. He's never been back to the site. What he forgot was in 1982, he wrote a paper with Gurdeep Singh and Peter Ewendike, where they said they found evidence of fire stick farming on the Great Barrier Reef that meant humans were there 180,000 years ago. So theoretically, he's already done other work like that. But look what his answer was. I don't want to do it anymore until there's another paper that proves it. Man, did you forget your shopping list? Because 25 years before, because I always do, he'd already done that. But he even conveniently forgot the fact that he's already corroborated that date with earlier work. So what they do is I'll make an announcement like that and then leave it alone and don't come back to it. And the reason they don't come back to it is because these are inconvenient truths that sort of open up their history and say, well, look, we've got this wrong, we've got to look again. So it's a preconditioned part of Australian archaeology and to a lesser extent geology that when these things turn up, which they do all the time, let's forget trained into them.
Do you know, I just can't get over that mentality, I've got to say, especially in a field of science. I mean, isn't their whole philosophy, you know, to retest until you get the same? It just beggars belief, doesn't it? That this is why conspiracists, you know, come up with conspiracy theories when, you know, people don't go and do the correct investigation.
Well, that's exactly why they do it, because they look at it and think the whole nation isn't doing it, must be a conspiracy. I can tell you this, at an academic level, it's not, it's incompetency. At a higher level, I'm talking about the people who control everything, they already know this. It's a different level. The word conspiracy might fit into that, but when they put the academics in there, most of them have tenures that are semi-permanent in positions where admitting you're wrong is tantamount to harikari. It's really like political academic suicide to say, oh, I think I've made a mistake. I actually think academics that do that are the ones I admire the most, because it means they're open. Their minds are open to new ideas. I do remember.
But I don't get that at all, because if you look at the normal scientific fields, theories are created, and then, you know, 50 years happens and they disprove that theory and they create a new theory. This is the same. Archaeology should follow the same kind of pattern. Okay, we were up to 65,000 years. Well, now we're up to 180,000 years. Let's do, you know, it should be continuous learning and research and update. It just isn't that way. That's why I think the conspiracists get hold of this stuff, and they kind of think somebody's suppressing information. I don't know.
Look, there's a great example of that in America. There's a place in America called Lake Valsequillo. And Cynthia Earle, they found some archaeology there that was quite amazing, like an engraving of a three-tusked mastodon elephant that hasn't been in America for basically a million years. And they went down there and they took what was considered the best archaeological field they could take. They took geologists, people proficient in uranium series dating and different types of dating. And what they found was they were looking at human evidence, and there was a beautiful archaeological site that was sealed off by volcanic ash, and they could date it. And all of the geology and uranium series came up with dates of between 200 to 600,000 years.
Wow.
And there was about 7 different tests that were done. And they all came up in 6 figures, but they all said, but no one's been in America until 10,000 years ago. And what happened was, these people to this day, Virginia Stein McIntyre, who is now selling flowers because she was adamant she had dates of 300,000 years. What happened was that all of the geologists were dismissed, and the archaeologists, their theory held fast against the science that was given from the best science in America. And basically what happened in Lake Valsequillo to this very day, there are dates coming out of there that touch really get into 1 million years that have come out of Japan for this site. But in America, it was banned. No one went there for about 25, 30 years after, until a guy that was doing a business degree funded a 3-week trial where they found more evidence of a date that went way into 6 figures again, published it again, and no one looked at it. So it's not something that's just endemic to Australia. It goes around the world. And the reason is that the archaeologist, I'm going to be very frank about this, and I do a lot of archaeologists, are primarily people very clever with a spade and can do a drip line in a cave, and that's really about the sum total of it. When they want to go further, they bring in a geologist and say, look, I found this in this level of dirt there. Can you tell me what it is, what type of rock it is, and how old it is? And they'll do all that, and they'll give that back. But in Lake Valsequillo, they brought them in and they gave them the dates, and they just didn't want to hear it, so they dismissed it. And to this day in America, Lake Valsequillo is a place that's basically for archaeologists who want to keep a job. It is a complete no-go zone because every time you go there, you get 6 figures, and we get that in Australia too. So whenever that appears, what they do is they may listen to it, and then they'll write up a disclaiming paper. And I've seen them do it in Australia. Quite recently, we had a place called Jaminiman in Australia where we had dates of 119 and 179,000 years. And what they basically said was the science was perfect, but the grains that you measured received insufficient sunlight before they were buried. And I wondered to myself, how would you know where that rock was 179,000 years ago to know where the damn thing was, whether it was out in the shade or in the sun? They use things like that, and then 10 archaeologists will sign up alongside it, and they'll say, oh, it's been discredited. It was never discredited. Their discredit was rubbish, and it could never be proven, but everyone accepted it straight away. So there is a sort of an inbuilt resistance to any date that tries to change what they've made up, which is a story about some people coming out of Africa 60,000 years ago and then populating the rest of the world. Look, with Africa, let's just think about one thing there. The genome patterns of Africans, they have 6. For Australian Aboriginal people, they have so far 34 they've measured, and we've got 3 they don't even have measured yet, which brings it up to 37. Now, explain to me how it can be that the Africans can be older when they've got 6 genome patterns and the original people have close to 40. They can't be older. That's just common sense.
Yes,
but believe it or not, that is pure science that nobody will challenge. Now, the Russians quite recently did some study. It was called the walkthrough test. It was the largest study of men's semen, Y chromosomes, to find out the links between Africans. And what they did was they took 400 samples of non-Africans from all over the world, not just Aboriginal people, but all other races, but not Africans, and then compared it to 13 distinct African markers to find out how much of a correlation there was. Do you know how many times there was a correlation between those 400 people and the 13 distinct markers? None. They got a score of none.
None, aren't you?
None out of 5,200.
Wow.
But you'll find if you go to all the universities, everyone will tell you, oh, that we all came from the Africans. Well, if Eve did, I don't know where Adam came from, because his Y chromosomes did not come from Africa. That's the one thing the Russian group proved. So really, the evidence is all around the place. So what they do, as I said, is they when this sort of evidence comes out, you'll never read it about it mainstream, and they block it as much as they can. It sneaks out for a couple of days, then disappears. It's a very clever fact, but that's the way they work.
Well, hopefully there's, the same way that social media has kind of reinvigorated the news systems. I'm hoping that social media and stations like Revolution Radio that we're on now will also help to get your message out further than the mainstream could anyway. As you were talking there, it actually made me think about the six. I think there's 6 root races. There's a theory or a myth about we've kind of doomed ourselves 6 times previously, and the years that you were talking about would give credence to that theory. So you've obviously heard of the root races, yes?
Yeah. The fact that there were earlier races and they wiped themselves out in different ways. Look, if you go through history, you're going to go back 10 to 12,000 years, and you can ask the archaeologists, and they'll reluctantly agree to this. Our population dropped by 95%. What happened? What happened? They say, oh, before that there was nothing. We were all walking around in caves and grunting. That's not true at all. Something happened at that stage where everything got wiped out, and then we started up again. And that's the one. We've picked it up from there. We say basically that civilization and knowledge and intelligence and all the things that make Homo sapiens sapien. I wonder why they repeat the word twice, because it's a lie. Why they came about then, basically, and all the things that make us special came about in the last 8 to 10,000 years. No, there were earlier civilizations, quite a few of them. We've seen them in Australia. We've seen massive evidence of earlier civilizations that were very sophisticated, using science we don't have today. Absolutely.
Well, isn't the fact that we have 6 distinct races on the planet proof enough?
Well, it should be, but it's not.
I've always thought that's quite obvious, that there's 6 sources of at least, I've always been a big believer in that, certain races have been selected and their DNA has been manipulated by different sources, a lot of the ufology followers believe that the white Caucasian race has, the tall white ET race we have their DNA as well as human DNA, and the Japanese race has grey DNA. If you think about it logically, there's probably something to that. But we have to wait for people like yourself, Stephen, to actually give us a bit more proof before people come out and actually discuss this.
Two new hominid samples found in Australia.
So tell us about the 2 new hominid samples found in Australia and how they are the missing links that led up to Homo sapien man. I'm not sure how much knowledge our listeners have. You may want to put a little bit of a diagram, to explain where we are on that scale. I think everybody understands the ape to human scale. We've all seen that picture a number of times.
Oh, we all have, haven't we? Yeah.
Yeah, you might just explain that to the listeners and how our 2 fit in.
Yeah. Well, basically what we've found is I've seen 2 personally. One I have, was given to me by a professor. We've seen a race. What actually took place, I won't go into details how I got to the first site, but the first site I got to had 2 beings that were buried 1 metre apart, and originally their arms were folded across their chest and their knees were brought up there, and they were facing east together. They're completely different from one another. The one that, of course, has created the most concern with the government is the one that has, it just basically has the largest eyes of any hominin that's been found anywhere on this planet, and that's come to me by the person who actually rebuilt the skull. It's just been rebuilt. We've taken all the bits and pieces from one of these skulls, put it back together, and we have a 3-dimensional skull we'll be showing people. It's actually going to be dried in 2 more days. And he said himself, I have never seen anything like it in the world ever. This being is unusual because, look, very simply, humans and hominins have a sutured brain. Well, we've got 3 bones that join up gradually. When we're born as children, They're not fused. That's why we don't touch the top. We all know that. What we don't understand is that is what made Lucy, with a brain capacity of about 500 cc, into what we are today, which is 1300 cc, which is 2.5 times that, because the brain can open up a bit more all the time, and because it doesn't fuse, there's room for us to build. But ladies and gentlemen, I can also make another point, that all apes and gorillas and monkeys have what's called a sagittal keel, which means their brain can never get larger. It is locked into one dimension. And of course, it makes a bit of a lie, the idea we're supposed to come from the same species. If one can never grow its brain and the other one can, they're not the same species. But that's a different story. We won't go down that line. For now, what we have with these ones we've seen is at least 2 of them don't have any suturing at all. They don't have sutures, which means they can't be a sapien and they can't be a hominin. Now, the interesting part is the one that we're interested in, the 3 that we're interested in, the 2 that I've seen, what basically takes place is when you get to the eyebrows and you have these massive eyes, from that point on, if you were to look face to face with that person, there's nothing above it. There's nothing there. Lucy has a little bit of a bulge above and a bit of a forehead. These guys have nothing. With one of them, the more extreme one, I've got a Denisovan at the moment, which has from the eyebrow ridge, it has a rise of 6.5 centimetres. The highest rise I can get, which is about 3.5 centimetres going directly backwards, is 0.5 centimetre above the eyebrow length. And after that, it drops back down 4 or 5 centimetres and continues. What it actually means is that at least 95% of this brain that's positioned in this body is below the level of the eyes. Think of us and think about where your brain is positioned. It's nearly all above the eyes. This one, you would have to say there would be 2 to 3% of that brain that would be above eye level, and all the rest of it drops. What I also noticed with this, the one I've got at the moment, is as it starts to drop, it drops severely, so that some of that brain would be below the level of the chins and still a lot more to go. So then you ask yourself, what sort of neck does this being have? And it has to be completely different from ours. Now, amazing as that may seem, and believe me, we have pictures up, and I've got one in probably 5 meters away from me right now. And when you look at it, all you see is the 2 eyes, and you see nothing behind it. The interesting part of the story with this being is not even the head. It's the humerus bone. And the humerus bone, for me, just wipes out this planet as a source. Now, the reason that is the case is because a humerus bone, which is from the shoulder to the elbow, yours and mine will measure around 30 centimetres. Gibbons have it at 35 centimetres because we know how they use their arms. And maybe LeBron or someone like that might have about 33 centimetres, okay, because they're slightly longer arms. Yep. What they will not have is 43, and when the arm is broken, and I still can't find the elbow. And that's what I found. Those 2 bones were thrown out the side when the government authorities put that skull back. When they put it back and they just threw the bones everywhere, they were supposed to be against the chest, but they didn't care. That bone is at least 45. Then you put on top of it the bone that goes from the elbow down to the wrist. And what you've got already is when you put the fingers below there is you have an arm that's well over 1 metre long. It will be nearly dragging in the ground. Now, that might seem quite bizarre, but maybe nature did this because these guys might be hanging out of trees, but they can't because the bone is only 1 centimetre thick.
Oh, okay.
This is the problem I've got, ladies and gentlemen, is that we measured this. I picked it up. And what was interesting, I picked up the femur first and measured it. It was 42, which is hip to knee, and I'm 42. So I'm saying this being, because you can do this sort of stuff with arms and legs, you can work out how tall they are. This being's 5'10". Take the humerus bone, and I've got to give this guy a height of around 7'10" to 8 foot.
Wow.
Because I've got a leg that tells me 5'10", and I've got an arm that tells me 8 foot something. Well, this isn't quite right. But the problem I've got, even when you throw that together, is I've got a bone that is 1 centimetre thick. And if you put the sinews and muscles on that, in this gravity, on this planet, that is a useless appendage. It won't do anything. So the question I asked when I saw this and measured it is, why would nature on this planet create a being where its biggest appendage is the arms, but they can't function. It's a useless, it won't, I mean, you threw a rock at this and you could break this arm. It's not strong enough to even carry itself around. It will just hang limply and do nothing. And then I look at the eyes, and the eyes are the largest I've ever seen. On the one I saw in the that was buried, the widest part of the face was 10 centimetres, and the eyes took up 8.8 of it. And the eyes, when you remember there's no forehead, you've basically got a pair of eyes that take up 50% of the whole face because it's got a very narrow jaw. And then I look at this and I'm saying to myself, these eyes are not functional during the daytime. They're nocturnal. So these eyes won't work during the day, but the arms won't work at any time. And then I thought to myself, where am I going to find a place that has half the gravity and no sunlight? And the obvious answer is anywhere in space but on the planet Earth. Because outside, somewhere else where the gravity was half of what it is on this Earth, then that arm of 1 centimetre is more functional. It then can have larger sinews because the gravity is not as great. That's just how it works. So when we looked at these things together, I've got a being that has a forehead that grows backwards. It doesn't go up at all. I've got arms that don't work here. I've got eyes that don't work unless it's completely dark. And I asked myself, where is my parallel on this planet? And the answer is I haven't got one. No. And then I got 2 experts. One is the top geologist in this country who's looked at this and said this is not a Homo sapien. And I've got another guy that's just put the skull together who said it's not like anything, and he's done everything. He's worked on every type of skull there is, and he says it's not like anything else on the planet. Well, there you go. If it's not like anything on the planet, then I better look for another planet because there's nothing here that comes close.
Exactly.
And that's basically where we've got to at the moment. As I said, the skull is now formed up into, well, I mean, I've got the original bones back, but we'll have that model for our talk in Melbourne. We won't have it for the Sunshine Coast because I've got to go back down to Sydney where it's been done at the laboratory there. And what it tells me is this, ladies and gentlemen, is that the original people in the whole of Australia, there are around about 400 to 500 tribes and 400 to 500 distinct languages and 400 to 500 distinct cultures with their own dreaming stories that belong to their land. There is only one dreaming story that can be found in Gangamaya, that can be found in Lake Mungo, can be found in Tasmania, can be found anywhere in Australia and in every tribe. And it's the story of the 7 sisters from the Pleiades. So my question is, I asked the original people, where did this skull come from? And they'll all tell me, and they have told me the same thing. It comes from the Pleiades. Why do we know this? Because this is the one story that binds every original person of the old way law together, the 7 sisters from Pleiades. And the story doesn't vary much. The Orion, which is the male that chases the sisters, is normally not a good person. Sometimes he's not too bad. Most times he doesn't get the sisters. On one occasion he does. But the trick is, in every occasion, the sisters come to Australia and land here. And then Orion chases them. But it takes place on the land. It's not up in the sky, because some people think, oh, it's talking about them going across the sky. No, it's not. I've heard all the stories. They come here. So if they come here, where do we find them? And I think we found the 3 of them. The elders told me we'd find 3 of these skulls. And I remember when I heard that to begin with, I thought that's not going to happen. But we have. And in each case, I call them no forehead people because they don't have one. And then, of course, then you think about when you reconstruct this skull, which we're doing, we've got people who are going to put flesh on it next. Where do I put the hair?
There isn't any hair.
No, I don't think there is. I don't think there can be. So there won't be any hair. So we've got a hominin that doesn't grow hair. Hang on, they all do. And then we've got no forehead, which they all have, and sutures, which we don't have in most of these beings anyway. No, they don't fit. They don't belong here. And what I find interesting...
You haven't even discussed the skin colour, Stephen.
No, we haven't. We don't know what the skin colour is, although my understanding from the elders is they tend to feel like the Pleiadians have they keep talking about the colour blue, so I don't know if that relates to skin or not, but they do mention that a fair bit. But what we found in both these two is we found that these fine-boned beings that I think come from the Pleiades, and next to the first Pleiadian, we found a being that had a skull that was twice as thick, 13 mils as opposed to 6, and at the back had a square knob, very much like Neanderthal. And we found that in the first occasion. On the second occasion, with the skull I've got, along with the skull that was found in 1953, we think what we have there is a Denisovan. Now, what we're told is the Neanderthals and Denisovans are found in Europe, they're found in Asia, but they're never found in Australia. I believe what I'm looking at here is how Homo sapien comes out of part Neanderthal, and we know we have Neanderthal in us, part Denisovan and part Pleiadian. And what we're seeing in Australia is the mixture of Neanderthal, Denisovan and off-world together to create what we think could be what people refer to as the Adam and Eve story, but done differently.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's, I can see. Is this under lock and key? Because I can't imagine anyone wanting these bones to be, out there in the mainstream, to be honest.
Yeah, it is and it isn't. It's under lock and key because the first site, which is actually a burial site, the farmer, when he found this 3 years ago, went to the government. The government sent officials who took the skulls away and all the skeletons and threw them back in a heap, didn't put them back properly. And they came back to the farmer and said, there's nothing to see here, don't talk about it anymore. And then the next day some representatives came around and threatened him and told him if anyone was to come on site, he'd be put in jail. That's why there was nothing to see there. That's what you do when there's nothing worthwhile to look at. You come around the next day and threaten the farmer to be put in jail. And he actually listened to that for 2 years, kept looking at the skull and knew it wasn't a Homo sapien, which is what they said it was. Yeah. And by a variety of things that take place that I won't go through now, I got called down to have a look at it, and we actually had 1 day on site to bring it back to life again. It is under lock and key because after I did the first set of articles, I got my second letter from the government threatening to put me in jail, and the place was shut down completely. No one is allowed to look at it, and there will be no science done there.
Right. Typical.
So that site's completely cut out. The skull I've got, which is in our house right now, they cannot touch. Now, the reason for that is legally in 1963 in Australia, the original people were not counted as human beings. They were counted as flora and fauna. They were counted like kangaroos and koalas. They were not counted as people, and therefore there were no laws for them. So when these skulls were found in 1953, there was no protection for these skulls, and because they didn't make a retrospective law, the person who owned these skulls had them for about 60 years, and after 50 years it becomes their property. It's not owned by the original people, even though it's their story. And it was given to that lady, to a professor, and then they both agreed to give it to me. So legally, they can't take that off us. The third set of skulls we've just found have been found by 2 people who've told no one else in the country where it is, and we're going to see them in a couple of months. And as no one else knows where they are, and I'm not going to give any clues, and I'm not going to say who they are, they won't know where they are. And what we'll do there is we'll go on with elders, we'll look at this, we'll photograph it, we'll do what we can, then we'll bury it properly and leave it with the elders to give it ceremony. With the skull I've got at the moment, I only took it off them under the condition, once the science was done, I found the location, they gave me the location where they originally came from. Once the science is done, they will be taken back there. They will not be put in museums. They'll be buried there and given to elders to look after and give ceremony. So all these skulls will go back to where they belong. But unfortunately, the first set of skulls right now belong to the Australian government, and they don't want anyone to look at them.
Yeah, typical.
Well, that's all for our podcast. Thanks for listening, and remember, if you want to support what we do, then share, subscribe, and leave a positive review over on iTunes for the open-minded skeptic. My team and I look forward to entertaining you once again in our next podcast. To check when our next podcast is, simply head over to www.tomspod.com. That's www.tomspod.com.